In the grand theater of history, we are conditioned to believe that nations die by the sword. We expect the thunder of artillery, the clash of steel, and the rivers of blood. But the most lethal weapon of the 19th century did not fire a bullet. It was silent. It was invisible. And it was far more devastating than any army. For centuries, the sultans had managed their liquidity crisis with medieval tricks, debasing the currency by mixing copper with gold, or simply confiscating the estates of wealthy officials who fell out of favor. But in the modern era, these primitive maneuvers no longer sufficed. The empire was starving for capital. It needed vast sums to construct a modern army capable of repelling the predatory Russian Empire looming to the north. It needed to string telegraph wires and pave roads. It needed to perform a pantomime of being a modern European power. For decades, the Ottoman rulers had resisted the siren song of Western credit. There was a profound cultural and religious aversion to usury, the charging of interest, and a deep-seated political paranoia about becoming beholden to the Christian powers of Europe. But in 1853, the dam finally broke. The Russian Empire, sensing weakness, invaded Ottoman territory, igniting the conflagration known as the Crimean War. This was a conflict of industrial scale that the Ottomans could not possibly afford to wage alone. Britain and France, paralyzed by the fear of Russian expansionism, intervened to prop up the Turks. They dispatched their armies and their ironclad fleets to the Black Sea, but more importantly, they sent their bankers. War is an expensive business, and the conflict was draining the Ottoman treasury of millions of gold liras that simply did not exist. Soldiers required wages, foundries required metal for cannons, and the fleet required coal and provisions. The Sultan, Abdülmecid I, found himself in a position of agonizing desperation. His advisors whispered the hard truth. There was no alternative. To save the physical borders of the empire, he had to shatter the ancient financial taboo. He had to accept a loan. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its debt warrant, disguised as a loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French financiers. It was presented to the public as a lifeline, a noble gesture of solidarity between allies fighting a common Russian foe. But in the cold light of financial reality, it was the first shackle of a golden handcuff. The terms were extortionate. The bankers, fully aware that the Ottomans were a high credit risk, demanded a price that bordered on theft. The issue price was set at 80. Let us pause to understand the cruelty of that number. It meant that for every 100 pounds of debt the Sultan signed his name to, he received only 80 pounds in actual cash. The bank kept the remaining 20 pounds as an upfront commission and a risk premium. Yet, the empire was legally obligated to pay interest on the full 100 pounds. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance. They were borrowing capital at punishingly high effective interest rates while receiving significantly less money than they owed. However, when the cash finally arrived in Istanbul, it felt like divine intervention. Suddenly, the mutinous whispers of unpaid soldiers were silenced. The crisis was momentarily averted. The Russians were eventually beaten back, and the Sultan felt a narcotic rush of relief and power. He had discovered a dark alchemy. He realized that with a mere signature on a parchment in London, he could summon fleets of gold to his doorstep without the messy business of tax reform. The war concluded in 1856, but the borrowing had only just begun. The Sultan and the Ottoman elite had tasted the forbidden fruit of easy credit, and the addiction was instantaneous and total. In the grand theater of history, we are conditioned to believe that nations die by the sword. We expect the thunder of artillery, the clash of steel, and the rivers of blood. But the most lethal weapon of the 19th century did not fire a bullet. It was silent. It was invisible. And it was far more devastating than any army. They looked toward the glittering capitals of London and Paris, with their gas-lit boulevards, their macadamized roads, and their marble opera houses, and they felt a profound, gnawing sense of inferiority. They yearned for Istanbul to mirror the modern European metropolis. They wanted to banish the label of the sick man of Europe and prove to the world that they were a civilized, wealthy, and relevant power. So they began to spend. But they did not invest this borrowed fortune in textile factories, or irrigation networks, or technical schools, things that would generate a return on investment. No, they squandered it on prestige. They spent it on the ultimate symbol of imperial vanity, the Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdülmecid decided that the Topkapi Palace, the stone heart of his ancestors for 400 years, was too antiquated. It was too Asian. He desired a residence that would rival Versailles, a structure that would make Queen Victoria tremble with envy. He ordered the construction of a colossal edifice on the shores of the Bosphorus. The Dolmabahce Palace is a structure of staggering, blinding opulence. It is laden with 14 tons of gold leaf. It houses the largest crystal chandelier in the known world, a personal gift from the British Queen. The staircase is constructed of baccarat crystal. The carpets are hand-woven silk. The walls are lined with Italian marble. It is a breathtakingly beautiful building, but it is also a tombstone. It was constructed entirely on credit. While the peasants of Anatolia scratched a living from the parched earth with wooden plows, the Sultan was importing crystal from Bohemia and gold from France to decorate a house he could not afford. The final bill for the palace was 5 million Ottoman gold liras, equivalent to a quarter of the entire annual tax revenue of the empire. To finance this madness, the Sultan returned to the bankers in 1855, then again in 1858, and yet again in 1860. Each time, the financiers in London and Paris were all too happy to extend the credit. They were amassing fortunes on the commissions and the usurious interest rates. They knew the empire was drowning, but they operated under the assumption of moral hazard. They believed that the governments of Britain and France would never allow the Ottomans to collapse completely, simply because the empire was geographically too critical to the balance of power. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had mutated into a classic Ponzi scheme. The empire was not generating enough tax revenue to service the interest on the old loans. Consequently, it had to take out new loans solely to pay the interest on the previous ones. They were digging a new hole to fill the old hole. The debt payments began to devour the national budget like a parasite. In 1860, the empire was spending perhaps 15% of its income on debt service. By 1870, that number had metastasized to over 50%. Consider the horror of that statistic. 50 cents of every dollar collected from a fisherman in Greece or a farmer in Syria was leaving the country instantly to pay a coupon to a bondholder in London. This meant there was zero capital left for the army, zero for the navy, zero for schools, and zero for infrastructure. The state was being hollowed out from the inside. To keep this dying system on life support, the government turned to a shadowy group of local financiers known as the Galata bankers. The dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, the supreme power of the Middle East, was not achieved by generals plotting in war rooms, but by accountants scribbling in ledgers. It was a conquest secured not with gunpowder, but with the ruthless mathematics of compound interest. This is the untold chronicle of the first true debt trap in the modern era. These were primarily Greek and Armenian families residing in the Galata district of Istanbul, acting as loan sharks to the imperial throne. When the treasury ran dry weeks before a European loan was scheduled to arrive, the Grand Vizier would go hat in hand to the Galata bankers, owing money at short-term rates of 18%, 20%, or even higher. It was financial suicide. The Sultan during this period was Abdulaziz, who had succeeded his brother. Abdulaziz was a man possessed by a massive ego and a fetish for military hardware. He did not just build palaces, he built a navy. He looked at the British Royal Navy and decided he required a matching set. He ordered massive ironclad warships from British shipyards. He purchased the latest corrupt cannons from Germany. For a brief, shining moment, the Ottoman Navy was statistically the third largest in the world, on paper. But it was a phantom fleet. The empire could not afford the coal to fuel the ships or the mechanics to maintain the engines. The ships sat in the Golden Horn, rotting at anchor, floating piles of debt. Then, the tipping point arrived in 1873. A financial panic erupted in Vienna and sent shockwaves across the globe, triggering a recession known as the Long Depression. Global capital evaporated overnight. The European banks, facing their own liquidity crisis, turned off the tap. The music stopped, and as if cursed by the heavens, nature itself turned against the Ottomans at the exact same moment. A catastrophic drought struck the agricultural heartland of Anatolia in 1873 and 1874. The crops withered in the fields, the livestock died of thirst, the peasants, the very tax base of the empire, faced mass starvation. Famine stalked the land like a specter. When the tax collectors arrived in the villages demanding payment, they found nothing but dust and corpses. The revenue stream collapsed completely, yet the debt payments remained fixed and unforgiving. In the summer of 1875, the Grand Vizier Mahmud Nadim Pasha looked at the imperial ledgers and realized the charade was over. The treasury was empty. A massive payment was due to the European bondholders in October, and there was simply no cash to meet it. He attempted to float a new loan, but the markets were closed to him. No one would lend a single penny to the sick man. The empire faced a binary choice. It could starve its own people to pay foreign bankers, or it could stop paying. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued a decree that shook the financial pillars of Europe. It was known as the Decree of Ramadan. In this document, the government announced it would slash its debt payments in half. It would pay 50% in cash and the other 50% in paper IOUs, promising a 5% return. In the polite, diplomatic language of the courts, this was a moratorium. In the brutal, naked language of finance, it was a default. The Ottoman Empire was bankrupt. The reaction in Europe was apoplectic. Millions of middle-class investors in Britain and France had purchased Ottoman bonds because they offered high yields. Vicars in England and shopkeepers in Paris saw their life savings wiped out overnight. The newspapers screamed that the Turks were thieves and swindlers. The diplomatic shield that Britain and France had held over the Ottomans against Russia evaporated instantly. This financial weakness was blood in the water, and it immediately invited aggression. Seeing that the Sultan was broke and friendless, the Russian Empire seized the opportunity to finish the job they had started in the Crimea. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 was an unmitigated disaster for the Ottomans. It is a terrifying case study of how a superpower, which had made Europe tremble for centuries, was slowly asphyxiated by the polite gentlemen of the London and Paris banking districts. It serves as a grim cautionary tale that resonates with the terrifying clarity in our current geopolitical climate because it proves a brutal truth. You do not need to invade a sovereign nation to own it. The Ottoman army fought with a desperate bravery, but they were unpaid, undersupplied and demoralized. The Russians marched all the way to the suburbs of Istanbul. From their forward positions, they could see the minarets of the Hagia Sophia. The empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty, ceding vast territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus. But the most devastating clause of the peace treaty was financial. The Russians imposed a massive war indemnity. They demanded that the Ottomans paid them over 800 million francs as punishment for the war. Now, the Ottoman Empire was in a truly impossible position. It owed hundreds of millions of pounds to the British and French bankers, which it had already defaulted on. And on top of that, it now owed a massive war debt to the Russian Tsar. The total debt load was now far greater than the entire value of the Ottoman economy. The empire was insolvent. It was defenseless. It had lost its credit, its territory, and its dignity. The Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who had ascended the throne during this chaos, sat in his palace knowing that he was the ruler of a corpse. He waited for the European powers to carve up his lands. But the British and the French had a different, more insidious idea. They did not want to conquer the Ottoman Empire territorially. That would be messy, expensive, and blood-soaked. It would require standing armies and complex administration. They had a much smarter strategy. They wanted to conquer it financially. They realized that if they simply annexed the Ottoman economy, they could extract wealth indefinitely without the hassle of governing the people. In 1881, the representatives of the European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. They were not generals wearing medals. They were bankers wearing suits. They carried briefcases, not swords. They sat down with the defeated Ottoman officials and dictated the terms of surrender. They were not asking for land. They were asking for the cash flow. This negotiation led to the Decree of Muharram, issued in December 1881. It was the death certificate of Ottoman independence and the birth certificate of the death trap. It established an organization that was unique in the history of imperialism, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, or the OPDA. This was the mechanism of the soft conquest. The OPDA was not a government agency. It was a private corporation run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It was headquartered in a massive fortress-like building in Istanbul that loomed over the city, a physical architectural symbol of who was really in charge. The decree handed over the empire's most valuable sources of revenue directly to this foreign corporation. The Sultan effectively agreed that he could no longer be trusted to collect taxes, so the OPDA would do it for him. The taxes on silk were handed over. The taxes on salt were handed over. The taxes on fishing, the taxes on spirits, the taxes on tobacco, and the stamp duty on all legal documents were all legally transferred to the control of European bankers. The OPDA built its own sprawling bureaucracy. It hired over 5,000 tax collectors. These men wore uniforms, carried weapons, and answered not to the Sultan, but to the board of directors. They fanned out across the empire, from the mountains of Macedonia to the coast of Syria. They went into the villages and the markets, and they collected the wealth of the Ottoman people. If a fisherman caught a fish in the Bosphorus, a portion of his profit went to pay a bondholder in London. You simply need to acquire its mortgage. To comprehend the magnitude of this tragedy, we must transport ourselves back to the middle of the 19th century. To the casual observer gazing upon the map of the world, the Ottoman Empire still appeared to be a titan. If a farmer harvested silk cocoons in Bursa, the profit went to a banker in Paris. If a peasant bought a bag of salt for his soup, the tax went to Berlin. It was a state within a state. The OPDA was incredibly efficient. Unlike the corrupt Ottoman bureaucracy, the OPDA was run with modern European accounting standards. They built warehouses. They modernized salt mines. They distributed disease-free silkworm eggs to farmers. They actually grew the economy. But they grew it for the benefit of the creditors, not the citizens. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly 1/3 of the total revenue of the Ottoman Empire. Reflect on that figure for a moment. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by the entire economy was siphoned off and sent abroad to service the debt. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps. They had to run a massive empire, pay an army, and maintain a court with only 2/3 of their own tax base. This meant that the Ottoman state remained perpetually poor. They could not invest in education. They could not build their own industries. They could not modernize their infrastructure. They were trapped in a vicious cycle of underdevelopment because their surplus capital was being extracted by the debt trap. The Sultan became a puppet in his own house. He reigned, but the OPDA ruled. If he wanted to build a school or a road, he had to ask the bankers if there was any money left over. Usually, there was not. But the debt trap did not just extract money. It extracted sovereignty. It became the tool by which the European powers manipulated Ottoman foreign policy. And this opened the door for a new player to enter the game. A player that would lead the empire to its final destruction. Germany, while Britain and France were content to simply squeeze the Ottomans for cash, Germany saw a strategic opportunity. The German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, visited Istanbul and embraced the Sultan. He told the Ottomans that the British and French were parasites who only wanted to bleed them dry. He claimed that Germany wanted to be a friend. Germany wanted to build them up. The Germans proposed a massive infrastructure project that would change the map of the world. The Berlin-Baghdad Railway. It was a dream of steel connecting the heart of Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East and the Persian Gulf, completely bypassing the British-controlled Suez Canal. For the Sultan, This was a lifeline. A railway would allow him to move troops to suppress rebellion. It would modernize the economy. It would tie him to a powerful military ally. But who would pay for it? The Ottoman treasury was empty, controlled by the OPDA. The Germans smiled and said, "Do not worry, we will lend you the money." So a new cycle of debt began. Deutsche Bank became the primary financier of the railway, but the Germans were just as predatory as the British. The contracts for the railway were extortionate. They included kilometric guarantees, which meant the Ottoman government had to pay the German companies a guaranteed profit for every mile of track, regardless of how much traffic the train carried. And crucially, the contracts gave the German companies the mineral rights to all the oil and resources found within 20 kilometers of the tracks. The Sultan had swapped the golden handcuffs of the British for the steel chains of the Germans. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic colony. German officers trained the army, German engineers ran the trains, German banks held the new debt. The British and French watched this development with the fury. They saw their influence slipping away. It was a colossus that straddled 3 continents, stretching from the rugged peaks of the Balkans in Europe across the snow-capped mountains of Anatolia, sweeping down to the holy sands of Mecca and Medina, and reaching across the scorching deserts of North Africa. They saw Germany gaining a foothold in the strategic Middle East. The debt of the sick man was no longer just a financial issue. It was a cause of friction that was pushing Europe toward World War I. By 1914, the Ottoman leadership, now dominated by the Young Turk movement, realized they were in a trap. They were desperate to break free. They knew that as long as the debt existed and the OPDA controlled their finances, they were not a free nation. When the war broke out in Europe, the Ottomans made a fatal calculation. They joined Germany. They believed that if Germany won the war, they could cancel the debts to Britain and France. They could abolish the OPDA. They could regain their financial independence. It was a gamble of everything or nothing. On the day they declared war, one of the first things the Ottoman government did was march to the headquarters of the OPDA in Istanbul. They expelled the British and French directors. They stopped the payments to London and Paris. For a brief moment, they felt the rush of freedom. But the gamble failed. The war was a catastrophe. The empire was destroyed, but the debt survived. When the Turkish Republic was founded by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in 1923, after a brutal war of independence, the European powers returned with their ledgers. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the British and French demanded that the new Turkey pay the debts of the dead empire. They argued that Turkey was the successor state. You inherited the land, they said. You inherit the mortgage. Ataturk fought hard, but he knew Turkey needed to be part of the global economy. He could not start a new nation as a defaulter, so he agreed to pay. The debt was restructured. The payments were lowered, but the obligation remained. The new Republic of Turkey, poor and devastated by war, spent its first 30 years sending millions of dollars abroad to pay for the reckless spending of the sultans from the 1850s. The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. It took exactly 100 years to pay off the mistake. The story of the Ottoman debt trap is the ultimate lesson in the danger of financial dependency. The Ottomans thought they could import modernity, They thought they could buy the appearance of a great power using other people's money. They did not realize that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether, every bond is a chain. The British and the French did not need to conquer Istanbul with soldiers. They did not need to garrison the cities. They simply waited for the compound interest to do the work. They proved that the most effective way to destroy an empire is not to attack it, but to lend it money it can never repay. The sick man of Europe did not die of old age. He was foreclosed upon, and the lesson he left behind is written in the red ink of the ledger book. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you will want to be among the few who saw it coming. From the Golden Horn of Istanbul, the Sultan ruled over millions of diverse subjects, sitting upon a throne that controlled the very crossroads of civilization. But this map was a lie. Beneath the veneer of imperial majesty, the foundation was crumbling. The empire was suffering from a terminal case of economic gangrene, while the Western powers of Britain and France were hurtling through the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines, laying iron railways, and constructing mass factories. The Ottoman economy remained frozen in amber. It was a medieval relic trying to survive in a modern ecosystem. It was a land of handcraftsmen and subsistence peasants, attempting to compete in a merciless world of mechanized industry. The treasuries of the Sultan were perpetually empty, echoing with the sound of hollow promises. The tax system was archaic, a chaotic web of inefficiency where corrupt local officials would skim half the revenue before it ever reached the capital.